Now let's talk about the topic that's often misunderstood and that's quite complex, or has been very complex in the past of many organizations, but has been greatly simplified recently in Azure. Directory synchronization. So in this video we are going to talk a little bit about how directory synchronization gets applied, what gets synchronized, and how these functionalities improve the experience of both administration and end users. So first of all, what is directory synchronization? Well, directory synchronization is the ability to synchronize directories in enterprise of any size that have an on-premise solution to the cloud. Whenever we are referring to directory synchronization in Azure, what we are trying to do is take our objects that are on our premises environment, and those objects are used for authentication. Essentially, we are talking about users and groups and synchronizing them over the cloud so that we can manage them by using Azure Cloud Tools. So directory synchronization is really the ability to integrate the two, and in order to have that integration between those two structures, your premise structures and your cloud structure, we need to synchronize them. Directory synchronization provides a single sign-on experience for end users. Once those directories are synchronized, a user can log onto this computer and access resources that are in the cloud, and through this configuration of directory synchronization, he will no longer be required to enter his password again. Therefore, single sign-on. Now, for the administrators, what's the benefit? Well, the benefit for administrators is that now we can see our entire listing of users of security objects, whatever they coming from or on-premier activity directory, or they are coming from our Azure AD into a single view. So we can manage them together. We can configure them together as an object that they have been created in Active Directory on Azure. Those objects can also be used to provide permissions and provide access to various resources that are stored in Azure in a simple way. When directory synchronization occurs, what happens is that those objects that are on premises get copied over the cloud, or a new object gets created essentially for them in Azure AD, and that object becomes a fully manageable object within Azure AD. In previous videos in this course, we saw how within the listing of users in Azure AD, we see the source of the object. Maybe it's coming from Office 365. Maybe it's coming from an on-premise Azure. Maybe it's coming from different directory on Azure. Well, the source of the object is always listed in the properties of the object in the user view. Now, what is being synchronized exactly? Well, the primary purposes of directory synchronization is really to synchronize our security objects, or users and groups. Now, we don't necessarily have the synchronization everything, and we will talk about that a little bit later on, but we can control that by really this is about synchronizing your user primarily. Now, for those users, we have attributes, properties. The attribute, whatever you are configuring them as custom attributes, or the standard attributes, or the users such as their department name, their phone number, their manager name, those are all properties technically in Azure. In Active Directory, we call them attributes. So those attributes can be synchronized as well. As well, we can define which attributes can synchronize. As well, we can define which attributes get synchronized. We have functionally of attributes mapping, which allows us to define which attributes will be matched to within considering attributes in Azure. So whenever we are selecting a specific property of a user, we may want it to be populated in a different field in Azure, and this gets controlled through the tool that we are going to use for directory synchronization that I will talk about very soon. No, not passwords. No, this can be confusing for some people that we are not actually synchronizing passwords through directory synchronization. But just a couple minutes ago, I mentioned that we have single sign-on experience. Users is no longer prompted to password twice. So how does that work? Well, the password itself, it's not synchronized because we don't want to pass that password. That stores information over the internet unsecure link potentially. Therefore, the password hash is passed. What is password hash? Well, password hash is basically a crypted version of the password that cannot be decrypted. That is passed on Azure. Azure takes that hash and then encrypts it again and stores it. And this is the hash that is used to authenticate the user. So what you log on once, your hash is created. And then by using the hash, the password does not have to be synchronized over the internet to Azure. So password synchronization through its named password synchronization, as I just mentioned, password itself is not synchronized. It's really the password hash. Password synchronization is the functionality that really doesn't require the user to log on the second time. Basically, again, this hash is shared between Azure and your on-premises environment. However, what happens when a user changes their password? So if I log on to my Azure ad portal and I change my password, I want to make sure that the password is then synced back down to on-premise Active Directory. In order to do that, we need to have password write back. These two terminologies and these two functionalities are enabled through the checkboxes, the tool that we use for directory synchronization, which I will talk about again in a couple of minutes. Password synchronization and password write back, those two functionalities do not require ADFS. This is an important point because many organizations in the past had to deploy ADFS Activity Directory. Federation services, in order to have those advanced password management functionalities. In Azure AD today, we do not need ADFS in order to provide this functionality. The functionality of single sign-on for the user and synchronize the password back. That has been changed password write back. All we have to do is click on the two checkboxes and get enabled. Another functionality that we have in directory synchronization is user filtering. Now, this is very useful when you want to define exactly which user do you trust to be synchronized to the cloud. You might not want your entire organization to be synchronized to the cloud. You may remember from previous videos that in Azure Activity Directory, we do not have organization units. And the way the accounts are managed is in the flat directory structure. Therefore, I may not want all of my users from Activity Directory on premises to appear in the Azure AD. How do I control that? User filtering. Again, a functionality of the tool that we use to synchronize. So what is the tool that we use for this situation? Well, primarily tool for this solution is called Azure Active Directory Connect or AAD Connect. AAD Connect is a wizard-based tool that we downloaded on our on-premise server and then we run it to provide a directory synchronization configuration. In order to run AAD Connect, you must have Activity Directory on-premise and it must be running at least on a Windows Server 2008 server. So if you have Windows Server 2003, you are out of luck. You need to upgrade to 2008 before you can perform these tasks. So AAD Connect is this tool that we install locally and then manage the synchronization. That synchronization will run in the background periodically and will maintain the directories up to date, even after you have configured it. So even though it is a one-time configuration, you can modify their configurations later on. If you need to, and that synchronization runs as services on your on-premises server on continuously synchronization between your on-premises Active Directories and Azure AD. Now we don't have here a full functioning internal two-directional environment to synchronize over to Azure AD. But let's still take a look at the configuration in Azure AD that we need to put in place in order to configure AAD Connect. So from within the Azure portal, I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory and here I see that I have option for Azure AD Connect. So this is the tool, as we have discussed, that will allow me to synchronize the information from my on-premises Active Directory to Azure. So here I would have to download the Azure AD Connect tool. This will download onto my server on my on-premises network. And then I will be able to run the synchronization. Now, depending on what I'm going to implement as my solution, whatever or not I will want to have. Single sign-on synchronize my passwords and have password right back into Active Directory. I may also need to download and configure the federation tools and also have ADFS Active Directory Federation service enabled on premises and in Azure. So there is a series of steps that would need to be implemented and some requirements at the domain controller level on premises as well, in order to ensure that this complete solution would function.